Welcome, everyone. And I want to thank Matt Powell, who's here today. Matt's the Executive Vice President of Fraud and Claims Management for the Consumer and Small Business Banking businesses at Wells Fargo. I'm Donna Turner, retired banker, retired from early warning, just really kind of focusing on advisory type roles in my current capacity. So I wanted to ask Matt to come here today. Matt and I have had an opportunity to work together previously in the fraud risk management arena, and I wanted to talk to him about something that I'm particularly passionate about, which is collaboration, and perhaps what I perceive to be is a bit of deterioration around collaboration, coupled with probably an even greater runway as we think about cross-sector collaboration, kind of even expanding the historical bounds of collaboration. So when we think about collaboration, Matt, we think about the definition of working with someone to produce or create something. And I think about a couple easy examples I think most people would be familiar with. One's the Falcon fraud risk model. It was built out of contributed data from all the Falcon participants, kind of an industry stalwart, and therefore it was a better, more predictive, more accurate, because all the participants collaborated, contributed their data to make it better, all the way up through something like an early warning services, a bank-owned consortium, contributive data to create shared solutions. So that's kind of the context I think about that. Given your background, I mean, what are some of the most effective points of collaboration you've seen over the years?
Yeah, well, you hit on several of them. So I've been doing this long enough. I remember the old strategy was just make the fraud hard enough to do it here than it is, one of the banks down the street. And I think we started to get to the point to say, hey, if we start to look at this as an industry issue and collaborate more and share data, and you hit on two good examples. As I think back about those weren't necessarily the easiest conversations to have. That was very innovative at the time, and I think people struggled. Well, my data is more valuable than their data, and are they getting disproportionate value out of this? And so it took some time to really get there. But I think the consortium models, 100%, and I think that laid the groundwork to say we should do more of this. And so I think what you came in with EWS and availability and those kind of things were huge beneficial, and things that we started to just absolutely rely on. And then I think about data compromises, similar strategy of how we shared information, and it became really collaborative around what we were wanting to do, pass that information on, so that we all sort of were working towards the common good. I think then kind of what happened is and it was sort of easy when we were all dealing with the same issue, especially for banks that had large card businesses. It was 70% of your fraud was in counterfeit fraud, and so all working towards a common good. Finally, chip and pin hits in the U.S., and fraudsters just immediately started to scatter, and so everyone was trying to, in some cases, fixing different issues. But I think we ultimately started to come back to start looking at device information and those types of things to say, hey, why can't we use this the same way we used it for in the transaction space? So it's been something that the fraud industry in general is very open kimono around wanting to share, and that because of, I think, the value associated with those types of key things that have really been defining moments in the fraud space relative to financial institutions.
So even though you've seen and you've experienced the benefit of those wins, those strong points of collaboration, do you agree that cross-FI collaboration has taken a step back?
I do. I do think there's those fundamental things of collaboration. I don't see anyone going away to say, I'm no longer interested in consortium type of information. I'm no longer interested in, being able to understand funds availability across, the ecosystem, et cetera. But I do think that there's, and I thought about this when we were talking about some of the potential dialogue today. And, I still think, and especially for payment areas that are more startup, fraud is still, I think, a decisionable action, fraud controls, to where it's an expense, and to say, hey, maybe I'm not the biggest player. I don't think what I'm doing is necessarily high risk. Why would I be targeted? So is it something that I need to invest in? Whereas there's other compliance, legal, those kind of things, items that are related. So I think the fact that that's still a decisionable item may hinder some of that. I think the fact that the fraudsters have just really gone very widespread. And so I think that's caused a lot of financial institutions to go head down, to very much be focused on what are the fraudsters doing to me? So I think that's slowed some of that progress. I think the reality is there's concern around financial institutions, their data, and where's it going and how's it being used. And so the expansion of that, because this is going outside of just transactions or funds availability and those kind of things. It's coming down to PII information, and it's coming down to even how do I know this device? How do I know it's Matt? The more banks are doing with behavioral biometrics and those kind of things, those would have so much value on a consortium wide. But it's how much of that information and what do people ultimately do with that data that I think has certainly put a pause on the level of how far that collaboration would go.
So the risk of reputation, perceived abuse, or real abuse of data beyond just fraud solutions is a big barrier at this point.
Yeah, big barrier, and I think that one of the challenges is one of those big barriers. It's not necessarily that there's all these facts and data to say, hey, this is the reason why we don't want to do it. It's the perceived what could happen, and kind of the folks that sit around and kind of come up with those scenarios and concepts that I think that then it becomes how much risk is it worth, and does the value reciprocate on the level of risk.
Is there anything on your radar or ideas you have on how do we change that trajectory?
It's a good question. So I'll give a real example. A lot of the banks have had this conversation around device information, and so could we get better information by sharing basic data elements associated with that, and this has been a conversation with a group of folks, and really intelligent folks, and I think folks that normally very focused on being able to get things done and being able to say, hey, let's move away from the exceptions, and that's generally how you build these processes backwards. Here's the worst possible thing that is a 1 in a billion chances, and then we work our way back to it. And so it was folks who really came at this from a common sense perspective, and it still just couldn't make it because of, I think, just the differentiation for the incremental value. So, and I think it comes back to, depending upon, the upside is there's so much innovation on the good guy side with new tools, new capabilities coming out, et cetera, that it becomes really challenging. Each bank sort of has gotten back to their special sauce. And so you start to say, well, if I start to dumb this down enough by peeling this all back and giving just a few bits of attribute for the amount of time, finite resources to get things done, tech resources, and then where your data goes to, I think those things are going to become a challenge that it's going to take, I think, some really innovative people to figure out how to get past that.
So you just hit on an interesting thing. You talked about new capabilities and innovations for good people. What do you foresee? Do you envision a future where the collaboration against fraud goes beyond just traditional FIs and includes neobanks and fintechs aggregators, maybe even reaching across to insurance or other sectors. Do you see that happening?
Short answer is yes, and it definitely needs to. You know, the fraudsters have no affinity to a certain product or channel or even institution. I think that a good example of that was during the pandemic. I mean, the fraudsters got immediately distracted with stealing from the government. And so with stimulus pay and what you saw with PPP and what you saw with employment fraud and those kind of things, to where that's a perfect example of the collaboration just between governments and states and banks and those kind of things. And it happened because of a crisis across the world, and it was immediate value. So I mean, that's an easy case to say. It doesn't matter about the type of organization you're in. If somebody's trying to steal data, there's ultimately they're trying to steal data. In a lot of cases, where they're stealing it from is not where the actual financial loss is going to happen. It's going to happen somewhere else, because people just by nature use that information. I don't have just information for my insurance and medical and those kind of things, and this completely different process for financial, et cetera. As a consumer, that becomes just passwords and usernames to me, as opposed to that's for this specific reason, or this is for my TV and those kind of things.
Yeah. So let me kind of thinking about solutions and another area, you can't go a day without hearing about machine learning and AI. Does machine learning actually hurt collaboration? Is the theory or the observation that the machines can learn faster than the humans, and does it devalue collaboration?
It's a really good question. I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. I think that especially with machine learning, the more data that you can give, the better. And so I think that some of that collaboration, if you peeled that out, that would be doing ourselves a disservice. So I think that anything that can help that learning. I do think it gets to the point of depending upon what problem you're trying to solve. So I think that from a transactional perspective, potentially that machine learning is something that can learn faster than banks would be able to share data. We have some real examples of that today, just known bad data and the length of time. Again, it's resources and just time in the day. However, I think that then you get into behavior type information. I think you get into how people just interact. So think about a new payment space that's coming up. I don't have years and years and hundreds of millions of transactions to build this very predictive model to say this is fraud or not. But the more I know about myself, this is Matt Powell, this is Matt Powell's device. That information, which can come from collaboration quickly. It's almost the concept of crowdsurfing into AI and ML, or crowdsourcing, or surfing, that'd be cool. But that crowdsourcing that data for your AI and ML models, which I think would add a ton of value. So I see values exclusively on both sides, but I don't think they need to be mutually exclusive, and one should be thrown out with focusing on a strategy that's one or the other.
One thing that I've been reading and listening to a lot right now is an increased level of collaboration with the bad guys. Talk about capabilities for good consumers and what's happening there, and that balance you just hit on with friction, et cetera. But are you observing this kind of increased collaboration and sharing, really, I guess, in the nefarious community? Like, are bots an example of what's going on there, and should that actually be a tailwind for returning to greater collaboration, whether it's between traditional FIs or that expanded network we just hit on?
It should, especially right now, and we've had a lot of recent conversations with some of the larger FIs for all the unfortunately wrong reasons, and the fraudsters right now are much more organized than the banks and the good guys. I'll just say that collectively across the whole security ecosystem, and it's a real challenge. And I think that it's something that they've created, it's not even the dark web anymore, but they've sort of created this environment of fraud as a service, to where everyone sort of plays their part in this, to where you don't have to be this brilliant hacker or be somebody who's overly technically savvy to go out and be part of a very organized group, that you have a very set piece of the process within that, and that comes with different risk, and that comes with different payout associated with that risk, and that's become very common, and there's a real structure to that. They obviously don't have to worry about data privacy and protection and go through QA and QC and all of those kind of things. So there's a nimbleness that I don't think we'll ever be caught up with, but they've figured out that sharing that information, and so the next person knows, well, you can slightly do ATM fraud at Bank of America, but Wells has this small shift to it. That information is so readily available that you almost start to get to the point to say, how are people getting? You can't be that lucky to where you see one bank shut it off and it's at another bank within hours. We've always seen a shift, but what we've seen in the last 12 months of the ability to shift so quickly is just shows that collaboration's at an all-time high. And for the banks that are doing it, because we're sort of having to do it, but it's highly manual, it's one-off, it's not systemic, it's not being driven by technology or data in a lot of cases. It's much more that data sharing, and it's becoming out of absolute need, as opposed to that we've really sat down and said, how do we get back to being more collaborative? Because I think it's something that is causing us to lose right now. I think financial institutions, nobody would say we're even kind of making ground up on the frauds right now. We're certainly chasing, I think, as an industry.
So two things kind of following up on that. Just for people that may not be as aware, these forums, these collaborative forums that the fraudsters have, there's thousands of members. Would you agree with that? So very large, very organized efforts to affect fraud across sectors. And you've also hit on something a couple times, and you really kind of finished with this. You said early on, right, that ability to chase the fraudster away, and particularly if you've got a lot going on, listen, I got to take care of my own house, as opposed to devaluing the fraud. Can you spend, and I know this is a bit of an audible for you, kind of explaining to everybody the chasing away versus what truly devaluing the data or whatever it is that's compromised and is attempting to be monetized?
So simple is kind of how we've used one-time passwords. So one-time passwords became a big authenticator, and that became a little bit of a holy grail for us, because we would try to use things like CVV2 or passwords and those kind of things, which easily compromised. And so the concept of using data that had a short life within the authentication life cycle. But we've seen one-time password become as ineffective as anything else that we've used, and fraudsters have really figured out through either scams or social engineering on how to do that, compromises of emails, things like that have really made it. And so I know that we talked a little bit about scams, but it really became, how do you make the data useless anymore. So where, as opposed to sending one-time passwords to people, you're sending stuff where all the interesting fraud stuff's happening in the background, and it just says, do you want to send Donna, $50? And I'm saying yes. All those things with one-time passwords and all that is happening in the background, so there is nothing to scam, there's nothing to compromise, so that becomes useless data within the ecosystem, or how do you want to pass that transaction. So I think it's things like that become much more interesting. I think the concept of card on file has flaws with it, and we've seen attacks that are purposely going after wallet transactions and being able to, for convenience, I've removed this thing of a plastic that at some point I would have to go sell or go make and that kind of stuff. And so you're starting to think that, so out of convenience, we're starting to add risk. And if we don't get to a place where some of this data becomes not interesting to fraudsters or things that they can't use, it's only going to continue to entice them to continue to try to compromise that information.
Yeah, as long as it holds value,
Yep.
they're going to continue to come after it. So you hit on a couple, I think, technological trends. One-time passwords, kind of perhaps their lifespan is coming to a close. What technology do you see on the horizon right now that's kind of intriguing in the fraud risk management space? Or even if, and you got a group of technologists here, like, wow, I wish somebody would really be focused and maybe creating something in a space?
Yeah, it's another good question. I know there's not a silver bullet. So if anyone was working on that, I would stop. But I do think that the upside that I see and have had the chance to spend some time in some labs around the world and really see some interesting things that are going on. So it's not from a lack of innovation in the space by any means. I don't think there's something just glaringly missing. I think the challenge for especially large institutions is the ability to implement, the speed to be able to implement, which really starts to make you think, if I'm going to spend resource time and try to, put something in of value, it has to be enabling technology. So it can't be about today's scam. It's got to be something that allows me more leverage. So I think that, as we look at, partners that we want to do business with, it is much more of less of a shiny object to say, hey, we've really figured out how to fix this, to where, I can, there's some folks out there, some vendors out there that are doing things to say, we'll indemnify you on that, you'll never have any account takeover on this account if they use this tool and they allow us to use their camera, and there's generally a set of these attributes. And I think that it's that I think is really interesting, because there's all of a sudden there's skin in the game on both sides, and I think that's an interesting concept. But I think then it becomes the reality of, it's amazing what consumers will give or put out on Instagram, but what give it to your bank or somebody else, and absolutely not. And so I think that that becomes the challenge, is usability of the tools. I think the integration, that it actually can work the way it's designed to work. Those are bigger challenges versus that there's not capability out there. Because if you go around, you'll see that somebody's sort of thought of everything a little bit. And I do think that there's this fundamental shift of people looking at, so much of fraud control was about the transaction. Does this transaction look risky? Does this, look like you? Should we be stopping it? Should we be calling, verifying, canceling? And it really needs to come, up front more towards the prevention aspect to say, if I feel comfortable this is Donna, I feel comfortable this is the device, do I care about the transaction anymore? And it goes back to not having these predictive models. In some cases, those become, I've had models perform like goalposts. There's as much fraud at 0 as there is at 100, and it just gets back to data availability. And so how do you solve that challenge? Go solve something else as opposed to trying to solve it. So I don't necessarily think that there's a big gap from a technology perspective. Not to say that should hinder the innovation in the space, but I think it just gets down to how do you reduce the friction out of it? How do you make sure it has a shelf life that's longer than 2-3 months, when it takes, in some cases, 2 years to get some of this implemented, and then you're at a point where you're fighting problems that aren't even problems anymore.
Yeah. You've kind of mentioned scams a couple times. Very much, I think, before the pandemic, right? Going back to your Nigerian uncle, they've always been an MO. They've always been an attack vector. More now in the news more than ever, particularly coming out of the pandemic, and just an array of presentations of scams. What do you see as kind of the untapped potential for collaboration and or technology in this scam space? Because it really affects all channels from crypto to cash.
Yeah. So the fraudsters have just gotten better. One, I've heard some of the impersonator frauds, and I mean, they sound great. They would pass 100% quality scores on my call monitoring in some cases. But I think what's becoming reality now is this concept of two-way authentication, to where it's as important on some of the scam activity for customers and consumers to be able to authenticate who they're talking to, who they think they're sending money to, as it is for the amount of time we spend to have passwords and all the behind the scene and passive authentication that we're doing. There's a level of expectation, I think, for consumers of being able to do the same. And so I think that's something, and I've seen a lot of very cool technologies that are coming up to, if it's in the app, you can always, if you're talking to somebody, or whether it's, a bank or it's Apple or whomever, you can go on the app and it will tell you, yes, you're talking to this company, or you're not talking to the company. And so I think there's going to become an expectation of just more two-way authentication, because I do think that in the large majority of cases, this isn't an abuse play. I think people are just legitimately getting scammed and have all intents to do the right thing, and so that becomes sort of an expectation on their part. I think the other piece we talked about is, how do you make this information useless? So you have to have something to scam. So it's going in and making these payments, or I'm going to send you this bad check, and then send it back to me through this channel or give me your one-time password. So how do you just start to limit static data in those transactions specifically? Otherwise, this is going to continue to be a real challenge, and it's something that we spend a lot of time on education, and I think education's important. But education's only good until you get duped, and we see people who get in these scams that work in fraud departments, and it's not it's just the timing, how good the person is, and have they found something that's really meaningful for that person, and then it's easy to scam.
Yeah, clearly it works, or they quit doing it. I think before we really open it up for questions, like any advice in closing for folks in the room that are facilitating payments, thinking about accepting payments for goods and services, interfaces, et cetera, at the risk of terrorizing them, like what do you think's what to be aware of? What's the 3 things you would have them be aware of as they potentially go down a payments processing, a payments acceptance space, to know about the bad guys?
Yeah, so one, I would say just good education up front. We get the opportunity both at Wells, and I was at Citi and Bank of America before, and we had a lot of opportunity to work with some startup companies, or to just have a chance to say, hey, we're interested. We've had some fraud problems. Can you give us, some information on it? And so those forums are open to learn more and kind of educate yourself. There's some things that you may not think of that folks who have been in the space for a long time. So the education part, I think, is really important. I think the upside is, especially in the startup space, the agility, low cost of solutions is massive, for the folks that have been, or the organizations that have been around for a long time, and the integrations are rough because it's, the fifth acquisition of the bank system that you're trying to figure out how to align to, that it really has become a highly cost-effective thing to be able to put controls in, and trying to put them in after you've built something is challenging. So doing it up front, and again, because that innovation on the good guy side has been so high, in a lot of cases, it's simple, it's easy, it's generally very headcount free in most cases, because they can do so much with modeling and getting that information. And lastly, not to try to hit on the purpose of the meeting, but I think that collaboration, and the more that we can talk about that, there's a lot of, generally the collaboration happens when somebody gets a call and says, hey, I have all these fraudulent, transactions that are coming from, this merchant or this financial institution, and you're having the conversation after the fraud's occurring. That collaboration up front, I think, is important to make sure that you go in well educated with the right tools. You've thought about this at the beginning, as opposed to trying to figure it out after you've built something and you're trying to chase the fraud around.
Because at that point, to kind of close the loop on something you touched on earlier, at that point, that data, that channel, that form factor of those goods or services, whatever it may be, now has value to the bad guys, and actually their rate of attack is just going to increase.
Yep.
Because they're making money.
Yeah, and it's not always about the theft of the financial transaction happening at step 2 of what the frauds are, gathering. It's about the data they're getting, the customer information, and they'll get it in pieces and parts. And if that means through multiple companies, and hey, I can get this good device information from this group, and then I can get their PII from over here, and that kind of stuff. It's very easy for them to put that together, and because we're so fragmented and segmented, we don't see where our susceptibility is and where that's happening within our own preview.
We do have a few minutes left if anybody has any questions for Matt or on the topic of fraud risk management collaboration. I can actually. Yes.
I was just curious, do banks self-insure for fraud at an aggregate scale? Are there insurance products that backstop that?
Sorry, we're going to make you repeat that. Say your name, please. That's on.
Hey, everybody. My name is George. I was just curious if banks self-insure for fraud on an aggregate scale, or is that some kind of insurance product that they can take out in the cyber field?
So there are insurance products for it. What I would tell you is generally from a fraud perspective, so if you think about commercial banking, generally that's, they do have that type of fraud protection. So think about things like data breaches and those kind of things that they would insure for. However, if it's somebody who was able to convince through a business email compromise for a legit person to send, $10 million, wire to somebody that a fraudster or whatever, that becomes a transaction that you did, you authorized, those kind of things, and so that insurance I've seen be less effective. Not that it hasn't been areas where it's been effective, and outside of the U.S. Those laws are different, but I haven't seen where insurance has been too effective in any large-scale fraud event, especially if it's some level of intent being whatever it is that they were involved in the fraud transaction.
Maybe. Just curious, there's obviously a stigma around fraud, which I think actually keeps people in the background from reporting those things out immediately when they happen. Is there a way that we as an industry can start to remove that stigma to get more people included in the collaborative discussion on that and hopefully get information out, especially to smaller financial institutions faster as these fraud schemes and breakout schemes happen?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I've seen that. I did have time in the commercial and corporate banking, and that's obviously something not that you would necessarily want as part of your marketing material about fraud, because it does happen. I mean, that's just the reality. I think in a lot of cases, because of profitability and those kind of things, you just look at that as it's cost of doing business, and for most financial institutions, fraud hits the P&L line as an expense. And so the same investment for people to stop fraud is going to hit the same line that where the fraud hits. And so I do think that there's a level of risk appetite associated with that. But I do think, and that kind of went back to Donna's comments for some of those fintechs that start up, is that that they're thinking about it after it happens, and then you're trying to figure out what exactly happened and be able to talk about it intelligently. And sometimes if you can't do that, you tend to hide it and try to, or not hide it, but you tend to talk about it behind closed doors to try to really understand what it is and make sure that there is no cause for concern. And I think that fraud has to be, and largely is, I think something that people want to collaborate on. But I do think that the more that you can get rid of that stigma, and I'm not sure that gets down to, I think, more of that risk appetite space, because you'll find some merchants that they'll be like, don't ever decline transactions at my merchant. We know what we're doing. We have our own fraud systems, and we feel confident that we've made a good decision to say, even if this is fraud, I'm still net, because I have such a high approval rate on my spend, that I want to have that. So there's lots of different reasons. I don't think that some of it's not wanting to be collaborative, but I think anything in the fraud space that you can do to be much more open, honest about it, it just allows everyone to get better.
Don't you, just to follow on to Peter's question, this notion of the small banks. I mean, that's really is, in my experience, where you hit that hurdle of where you might be, am I giving more than I'm getting in return? What is that smaller institution going to tell me about an attack vector or methodology? And again, it's balancing the time your team would need to put into conversation to educate smaller FIs with legitimate, what am I going to get in return for that value, as opposed to, could my time be better spent moving on to the next way that Wells Fargo or any larger institution's being attacked?
Yeah, I will say that there was a lot of feedback on that. I think the data sharing has become so simple to some extent, and to where you can automate so much of this, that the reality of how much time does it really take to benchmark and to say, hey, this is how much we spend, these are the kinds of things we do. We've even gone out and asked others to say, how much are you spending, in a year on fraud controls and those kind of things. There's really no value technically to somebody who's going to give me that information, but I would say, and for the most part, people are open to be able to talk about that. So I think that it's one, be involved in the right forums to where you do add value, because there are some that are better than others. But I think that stigma of I'm not going to get anything from you has largely died off, mainly because the amount of time and effort to actually be able to share the data and those kind of things has been pretty minimal.
Okay.
Question. What are the channels for collaboration between large banks like Wells Fargo and some of your regional, super regional banks. You mentioned data sharing. I mean, is it like building out a data warehouse with data sharing capabilities to trusted third parties? Is it forums at different conferences? How do you guys collaborate with your peers?
So a little bit of all the above. I think the most valued collaboration is the analytical side of it. So there's quite a few vendors that sort of do it for you. It's something where you have to sign up to say, I want to be part of the data sharing. So if you think about an EWS for that, and which you could certainly talk to, but part of being a member is the collaboration, and they sort of handle all of that in the background to where I'm getting insights and I'm getting value of being part of the network to understand that if there was a fraud ring at Chase, that they can't just blindly come to Wells, that I have information about that bad trend and those types of, so some of it happens systemically. And then from there, I think that you have very set organizations. Ariama is a very common one that has data, and they've spent a lot of time to make sure the data is clean, make sure the definitions are the same. So what I'm calling lost stolen is the same thing. What my peers that are looking at it, because that's one of the challenges, is if you're capturing data differently, if how one bank captures gross fraud versus net fraud, those types of things can be different. So the organizations that have really spent time and effort to say we have common definitions to where you feel really good about the data that's coming out, those are other really great ways. The networks, so we get a lot of great information from the Visas, the MasterCards, Amex, et cetera. So the amount of ability to get data is really, I would say, pretty large. But I think it's also, you can get data paralysis with that, to where you're looking at so much of it, it's hard to tell what that's really giving you. So I would say for some of those, I think they're pretty well documented out there with a little bit of research on who's really value add and who's not.
All right, we're out of time, so I just want to thank Matt Powell for coming today, sharing your insights and your knowledge and your direction for everybody here. Thanks, Matt.
Yep, no problem. Thanks.